Welcome everybody to this week's edition of the Articulation series. This week, every week we have a pairing of a different artist and rabbi from around the world. And this week we're very lucky to hear from Estee Eliss and Rabbi Jason Herman. Estee Eliss has contributed to the team at Tazria and in the Philly Stiebel, serves and works in their art programming. She will present to us part of her beautiful series of Divrei Torah, innovating Divrei Torah with comic book art. And we also have the privilege of hearing from Rabbi Jason Herman, Musmach of Yeshivat Chovevei Torah, and currently serves as the rabbi at the Hudson Yards and director of the IRF. So without further ado, I don't want to take any more of your time. Rabbi, would you please frame the Parsha for all of us?
Thank you for the introduction. Thank you, Dvir, and thank you, Estee, for being a wonderful chavruta to work with and exciting for this articulation this afternoon. So the Parsha this week is Tazria, which often, and it really should be seen in a context, is paired with Mitzorah, this year being a leap year. They are separated, but in thinking through those parshiot, they make sense to actually think of them as a unit. And in many sense, actually really is a unit that actually begins with the end of last week's parsha, with Parshat Shmini, because beginning from about the end of Parshat Shmini through these two parshiot, Tazria and Mitzorah, we have most of the laws of Tuma and Tara, which is often loosely translated, though it's a translation that I don't like, of purity and impurity. But when you actually look at the notion of Tuma and Tara, you don't actually see something. It becomes very obvious the deeper you get that this is not some magical thing that just exists in the world. There isn't some real thing, but rather it is, I would almost say, a mindfulness state of things that you encounter, and you become aware of the fact that you became tameh, and there's a process that you have to go through to become tahor. And we can gain deeper insight when we look at those things that become causes of tuma and causes therefore the process of becoming tahor. The main source of tuma, which actually does not actually come up in either of this week's parsha or the last week's or next week's, but it'll come up later in Bamidbar, but is often seen among the rabbis as the avi avota tuma, the ultimate case of tuma, is that of encountering a dead body. The notion of actually death in the world, and when you encounter death in the world, anyone who's ever been impacted by death knows that it leaves an impact. We're not the same person. Even if you've just been, actually, as the Tuma is going to impart, you've been in the same building, or especially in the same room as a dead body, you're not the same. Something's happened, and something needs to then go above it. So looking actually the other cases of Tuma, which you do get in this week's Parsha, perhaps gives us an insight of what it is that we're being impacted by and then need to move beyond. So the Parsha begins with the case of the Yoledet, a woman who was given birth. And it might tell us something. You might say, okay, well, that's actually the opposite of death. This is about new life. This is a joy. This is a simcha. Why is that put in the same category of Tuma that the dead body was? And I think one insight you might get is that the Parsha itself uses very creation-themed language. It says, im zachar teled, im nekeva teled, whether she has a zachar and nekeva. You almost never see the word zachar and nekeva except for the story of creation in Bereshit and this week's Parsha. So there's something actually about that language. I mean, we use zachar and nekeva just to describe grammar and dictive, but actually in the Torah itself, those are the only times you ever see it. So it's actually bringing us back in certain ways to the story of creation, which should give us some insight. And I would go further than this. I wrote in the Dvar Torah that we shared, is that I posited the theory that Tuma is everything that exists in the world as a consequence of our expulsion from Gan Eden. which you see as part of the creation story. So let's just quickly work through it, and you'll see as a way to present what's in the Parshiot. Death did not exist in the world until man ate from the Eitz Hadat. In fact, then God becomes concerned that man is going to eat from the Eitz HaChaim, the tree of life, as well. Death comes into the world as a consequence of the original sin and the expulsion in Gan Eden. So too, coming to last week's Parsha, the punishment to Adam was the punishment that man had to work the land. There wasn't work, everything was at our fingertips. Work is symbolized by utensils and kalim. So actually the end of last week's Parsha, we read about the tumah of kalim, how utensils can become tameh. They represent work. Chava's punishment was the punishment of a painful childbirth, that it would not be a seamless process. So even though childbirth is a joy and brings life, we know that it's not as it would have been had we not encountered. There's something different about that childbirth experience because of what happened in Gan Eden, and we're encountering that when you have an Isha Yoledet, a woman who is given birth. And I think that perhaps explains some of the commentators who say that the reason she brings a chatas and a sin offering is either going back to Chava, that's actually one of the main commentaries, or that she may have said something as a result of that pain. But again, that saying something, the result of that pain, brings us back to the Gan Eden story. So now let's move to really what's at the crux of most of the Parsha, is dealing with the case of Tzarat, which Tzarat is something that is a condition that affects different things. It's often translated as leprosy, but actually when you read the symptoms that are described, it's clearly not. Probably if you wanted a medical condition that it's probably closest to, which actually might work with the word, is actually psoriasis. Look at pictures of psoriasis and you'll actually see that it comes, in fact, the word psoriasis in English sounds like tzarat in certain ways, but even then it's probably, still something different. But tzarat is actually something that's not just a skin condition, because we know in the Parsha it also affects clothing and it affects houses, which will be in next week's Parsha. But those things are also things that didn't exist until we left Gan Eden. The first thing man did when man ate from the tree of knowledge is that man decided man is naked and man needed to clothe oneself. And actually, therefore, clothing becomes the first thing that exists. And obviously, if you didn't have clothing, there's no real assumption of houses either. And there's an interesting Ibn Ezra that you can actually look at for the end of the Gan Eden story, that actually after the Gan Eden story, man clothed with alei teina, with, we say, fig leaves. But then after the whole story, God provided man with God's clothing. And it says, V'al bishem kot not or, which we generally understand is that God made hides, of some animal skin for Adam and Chava. But the Ibn Ezra actually quotes potentially a midrash on V'al bishem kot not or, that literally God provided man with skin. That prior to Gan Eden, man was just flesh and bone, muscles and bone without skin. That layer of skin only becomes present once one leaves Gan Eden. And I wrote about this actually as these are things that protect us from the environment, our skin, our clothing, our houses, and we get tzarat when those layers are deemed to have been penetrated. Particularly with the skin, it says amok me'or b'saro, the tzarat is deeper than skin deep. Or the clothing, it actually has to get into the warp and the woof, and the houses has to get within the stones. But the other way I looked at it a little more recently in thinking about it is, in addition to these things being protecting from that which is on the outside, is that they also are meant to sort of hide that which is on the inside. And if you think about that which is in the Gan Eden story, the first thing that we read about Adam and Chava when they sin and eat from the Eitz Hadat is that they were embarrassed. You're embarrassed about something that's on the inside that sort of found its way out. And this is meant, these things are sort of trying to hide it, which might be the real connection between tzarat and lashon hara. That ultimately, what is lashon hara? Lashon hara is when you're revealing something that was meant to be kept private and now you've made it public, which is why then perhaps tzarat is a apt punishment for what happens in lashon hara. So you may have something that was meant to be in the privacy of somebody's home. is now been public. The walls have been, penetrated by that news. Or clothing, something someone tries to hide and cover up is a little more private. And even skin is what is presented toward the outside world, but inside we have a whole world of emotions and feelings that we don't necessarily always share. And that sort of feels like we've been penetrated when those things happen. And it's interesting, I wrote this as well, the term actually that the Torah uses to describe this, nega tzarat. Nega is something that's been affected by the outside. Tzarat, which actually is similar to the word, Rav Shimshon Hirsch compares it to the word zera as a seed, is something that's on the inside that sprouts forth. And both things are perhaps really at play. We're impacted by something on the outside that we thought we were protected from. But it's ultimately a result of something that was on the inside meant to be kept inside that found its way forward. And then finally, it's not this week's Parsha, but Parsha Mitzorah is going to end with what we call tuma. I would say minaguf is tuma that ultimately comes from inside the body. And it's various bodily emissions that there's something inside that still has made its way out, which is very similar to tzarat, only there it's actually both in the natural course of events as well as the unnatural course of events that make its way through. So I think all of this, when you encounter these things, should make us mindful of the fact that we are not in the presence of Gan Eden, which Gan Eden was really meant to represent when we were living in the full presence of the Shekhinah and God's presence. That gets recreated in first the Mishkan and later the Beit HaMikdash, which is why when you encounter something that's Tameh, the main consequence you read about in this week's Parsha is that you're not allowed to enter the Beit HaMikdash until you've done something to become Tahor. So we have to recognize that the world that we're in is not a world that we are always constantly aware of God's presence. And when we're reminded of that, we have to do something in order to re-enter a world in which we feel God ultimately present. So while sometimes a lot of the time Tumah and Tara can feel like something very esoteric, you can read these parshiot and kind of get into these details and almost feel like it's talking about something that is just so out there. Might ultimately remind us of those things in the world that exist in a world that's not ideal, that we're ultimately trying to be mindful of and strive to go beyond. So that's kind of the framing as well as a bit of the Dvar Torah, but I'm happy Estee illustrated this excellently.
Thank you, Rabbi. It was very interesting that you had written that this is one of your favorite parshiyot, and for many people, rabbis have a difficult time coming up with good Torah, and you clearly have a lot of interesting thoughts, and it came forth to bring together this beautiful art piece that Estee will present. So Estee, you have the stage.
Great. Thank you so much. Wonderful to be part of this conversation. And I'm really grateful for the Chavruta opportunity with Rabbi Jason. Thanks to you for putting it together. To start, what I'll do is I'll share my screen so we can take a look at this 9-page comic that I put together for Parshat Tazria. And then after that, I can talk a little bit about the process and this particular project in general. But to start, let me share my screen. Let's see. Are you able to see it? Thumbs up. Okay, cool.
Yes.
Great. What I'll do is rather than reading anything aloud, I'm going to have this as sort of like a quiet experience, reading experience, and I'll spend a few moments on each slide. That way there's time to read it before moving on to the next image. Okay, I'm going to stop the share for now. And thank you for reading along with me for that. It's kind of an interesting way to experience a comic together. I feel like one of the nice things about comics is that you get to turn the pages. And so I sort of took that away from you in this reading of it. But thanks for bearing with me with that. Okay, so I guess yes, time was your collective container. Thanks, Lona. I guess what I'll do now is I'll talk a little bit about projects that I work on in general, as well as the process of making these projects. And then I can more specifically talk about the process of making this particular comic. So generally speaking, a medium that I really enjoy both reading and working in is comics, graphic novel memoirs specifically, where you get to tell highly personal stories and reflections. In Jewish learning, there's definitely a rich tradition of text and also visual art. What I'm thinking about when I make these pieces, it's thinking about visual ways of representing text and experiences around texts. And so one of the things that I've been making recently have been some Dvar Torah comics. I think this is perhaps one of the things Dvar was mentioning, but I have this nice collection on Safaria, which you can check out, but I have some Dvar Torah comics where you can explore some different reflections on either parshiot or holidays, things like that. What's kind of unique about a Dvar Torah is that Divrei Torah or words of Torah, they're already this informal sort of participatory genre of Jewish teaching, and that it's something that anyone in the community can give. It's a bar or bat mitzvah speech, it's a wedding speech, it's something on the weekly parsha. It's open for anyone. And it's usually somehow tying together the themes of a parsha or of some Jewish learning thing and tying it to a personal, local, context-dependent experience. And so this is, I guess, what my projects are about in general, tying together Jewish learning to these personal moments of my own life and these personal experiences. So about the process, usually it starts with learning. And in this case, it was a conversation with Rabbi Jason Herman. And, I had done a little bit of reflection on the Parsha. And as Dvir mentioned, and as Rabbi Jason mentioned, Tazria is a tricky Parsha to really find material that speaks to you. But I knew we were going to be talking about Tzara to some degree. When Rabbi Jason Herman, he shared his words of Torah with such beautiful insights and wonderful content, I knew that there was going to be some great things to illustrate. But yes, thank you, dear, for that note in the chat as well. Right, so it was clear that there's going to be a lot to bring to life from this conversation. And then there was a lot that I was thinking about afterwards. After our chavruta, I was thinking about the ways in which skin, clothing, and structures, all the things that Rabbi Jason mentioned in his Dvar Torah, they do these things like shelter and contain. And then what I was experiencing in my own life, I was feeling and wondering if time could do those things as well. So these were the questions that I wanted to weave together in the comic itself. And visually, there were two main drafts of it. I can show, should I show like an earlier version of it, Dvir and or Rabbi Jason? Great.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Just to do a little peek behind to see what it looked like. There were two main drafts, and the first one was in marker. So if you give me a moment, I'll share my screen. So in this first version, we're just gonna, it won't be much reading, but you can kind of see that there's some images that made their way into the later version, but this was where we started. And in addition to this sort of drawn version, I also made a script, and I shared that with Rabbi Jason and Dvir. This was really helpful as part of the process, just to have this like final version, this produced version. That way we could talk about it and ask some questions and see where there were gaps in my own knowledge, wondering where I was understanding Rabbi Jason's Torah and making sure that I was getting it correct. And then also just seeing where it could be expanded from there. I also had some great feedback from some people who I'll give some special thanks to. Dalia Wolfson and Alona Bach, who are listening, and thank you for your help in helping clarify, nice heart reaction, helping me clarify what sort of things I was going to help make more clear in the next version. Additionally, I also had a conversation with a really talented animator named Hanan Harkol, and he encouraged me to think about how could I use the medium of comics to show things to the readers, or to share Torah, or to share ideas with readers in a way that I couldn't with other mediums. And so I revisited the second draft, which we looked at together with that in mind. I guess I'll point to some of the specific things, and then I guess after that, I'll turn it back to Rabbi Jason if we have for the next, for responses or any further parts in the conversation. But let me reshare my screen again, and I'll show you some specific changes that made their way in based on these conversations. So first of all, we have, in this case, I wanted to start with sort of an establishing shot. In other words, to help readers know where they're starting and where the story is taking place. It's both visually anchored and also textually anchored, with the background introduction. This also allowed me to set up a nice sort of symmetry where we have this as the beginning of the Zoom conversation. And then as we scroll through, there's sort of an echo of the same scene. This time the car is going in the opposite direction. And now we know that we're at the other end of the Zoom conversation. Additionally, you'll notice that in the times in which it's not in the Zoom conversation, there's a white background, and that's one convention that I have to identify one narrative voice. When we're in the Zoom space, it has this black background, and that's one of my ways of visually cueing up that we're in a digital space right now, and that's where this conversation is happening. I also was able to introduce our characters in this first shot with both words and images, which was kind of nice. And then I guess the two other things that I'll point to, one of them is somewhat of a visual midrash. And the clearest example where we have it here is in the feathers. In this scene where Rabbi Jason is talking about lashon hara, or malicious speech, I was trying to figure out how could I represent it. And in the earlier version, I had tried all of these other images, someone whispering, telling a secret, or maybe I would do a mouth or an ear, but all of these felt a little too literal. And instead, I chose to represent this with feathers based on this story. And I can't even remember the first time I heard this story in some Jewish learning context, but there's a Hasidic tale as it's told, in which someone comes to his Rabbi and says, how can I repent for the damage I've caused for malicious speech, lashon hara? The Rabbi tells him to go take a pillow, take it to the center of the square, tear it open and shake out the feathers. Do that on day one and then come back tomorrow. So the person does this. They take the feather pillow, rip it open, shake out the feathers. The next day they come to the Rabbi and they say, okay, what's the next step in my repentance process? How do I make better? How do I undo the damage? And the Rabbi tells him, go back now and collect all of those feathers. And the individual says, this is impossible. The feathers are gone. I cannot track them down. And the Rabbi says, this is what happens with malicious speech. You lose track of it. The damage is done in ways that's irreparable and you can't track it down. So this was an image that I thought of that I wanted to include in the comic. And if anyone is familiar with that story, when they see this, then they know that that's what this is a reference to. The last visual thing I want to point to is sort of a visual metaphor. And in this case, it's, I don't know if it's heavy-handed or not, but it's somewhat obvious what I'm doing, but I was trying to figure out what the end image that I wanted to, how is I going to close up the story? And I think because the sort of the sentiment that I wanted to walk away with was about moving forward in time and how time is just going to be part of any sort of process of recovery. In addition to having that with words, I'm standing on a literal sidewalk, like a moving sidewalk in the airport. And so that's like a neat affordance of comics where both the image and the words can work together to tell something that's greater than what either of them independently could do. I have more to say about comics, but I also want to pause and allow it to be more conversational. So I'm going to stop my screen share and stop talking for now.
Wow, so beautiful. And Sophia Freudenstein writes in the comments about the neutrality of Tuma and Tahara, and thinking about how they feel very charged And I'm curious if you have any thoughts about the weight that it's given.
Did you want to?
Was that a question?
First, or I can?
You feel free to, you can go ahead.
Yeah, so I like actually what Sophia wrote in terms of it just, being neutral. We often see these things as, positive, negative, as opposed to things that they are and that we encounter. In some cases they are negative, some cases they're positive, some cases they're neutral. But there's certainly things that impact us. There's certainly things that, affect us. If we're going to go to the classic case, of encountering a dead body, you cannot be unimpacted by a dead body. Death is part of life. It happens. It's not that it's, we, on the one hand, think of it as a bad thing. We're sad by it. Actually, though, interestingly, the Gemara actually, says, with respect to the deceased person, it says it's aliyah l'gabav, you read the l'gabenu, that for the person who's passing on, if they're going to Olam Haba, they're going up. That's why we always say you should have an aliyah in Gan Eden. But for us, it's Yerida. We're going down because we missed the person. We've had this gap in our lives, and we're impacted by it. And by the way, many of the same things that we respond to it are similar to the tzara'at, which is a form of death. The tzara'at, the metzora, is put outside the camp. Some damage has been done or tragedies happened to them, and they have to kind of leave and not be part of the way societies function. And those of us that impact death, close to us, we also do that. You leave society, so to speak, for at least a week. That's what Shiva is. You're not part of the world. You're actually, kind of going outside for a bit. And then you're sort of re-entering life in a slow, gradual process. It doesn't mean that you did something wrong. It's not a punishment per se, but we're impacted by it. And so too everything else. I think the Tumah is just kind of saying that these things exist in the world. They impact us, and therefore they require a bit of a response from us whenever we encounter it.
Yeah, thank you, Rabbi Jason, and thank you, Sophia, for that bringing that Torah out and into the conversation. I think just one other thing to add to that is this came up in our conversation with Rabbi Jason and I, and I think it was a question that had been one that I was holding through some learning with the Mind the Gap program the year before, which was run by Rabbi Dasi Fruchter. Maxine, who was on the call earlier, was a fellow student of mine in this program as well. But one of the things we talked about there in the class was this question of is Tumah bad? Is it a state? And I think something that was brought out in the conversation with Rabbi Jason and I was also that sort of question about, well, what about leaving Gan Eden? Was that a punishment, or was that something that needed to happen? And we looked together at the text and we talked about how Rabbi Jason mentioned there are sort of explicit things that are punishments that are listed, right? We have Adam needing to work and Chava having the experiences with childbirth and pain there. And then it's the removal from Gan Eden is less an explicit punishment and more of a moment of this just needs to happen, lest they eat from the tree of life. And so that also was a helpful way of framing or of understanding another really strong link between Tumah and Tara and the Gan Eden narrative.
Beautiful. Richard has a question, and say it out loud, but no Lashon Hara.
No Lashon Hara, of course not. Well, first of all, thank you both. Wonderful presentation, to say the least. And I think, Estee, your work is really a beautiful and accurate reflection of what Rabbi Herman's thoughts were. I have, though, I kind of have a basic problem, not with what you did. And in fact, even Rabbi Herman, how you took this, and you took something that normally is very difficult, and you really made it not only very positive, but also gave a lot of thought in it. The problem I have is the notion that Gan Eden was great, and that we were expelled from something, we lost something, and that the function of the Mishkan and then the Beis Hamikdash is kind of an attempt to reconstruct it. It's a wonderful notion, but to me, I have two deep problems with it. One, of course, we have neither. So now we don't have any of the three, right? We have neither Gan Eden, nor Mishkan, nor the Beis Hamikdash. And secondly, I really have a very different view of, quote, Eve's sin and the expulsion. The expulsion was the liberation of the human being. It was how we could become full human beings and actually have a human relationship with our Creator. It took time, and obviously, that's what the Torah is the telling of that whole development of that relationship. But so kind of like that, I'm not going to go on, but I mean, I think you're going to get my point. Human life is good, is rich, and is especially rich because we can relate to our Creator and serve Him as best as we can. And in Eden, we couldn't. We were children. We had no self-consciousness. Eve liberates us. And so, but anyway, that's it.
I mean, I actually want to respond. I think what you're saying is right, but partially. I think what's the key to what actually happened in Gan Eden? Because I think that actually informs a lot of this. On the one hand, you frame it as a liberation, which in many ways it was, but there's something else about that liberation. Because let's actually, when you look actually what God says, that man is going to eat from Eitz HaChaim and become, Achad Kamon, we're going to become like us. So what does it mean to be like God in that context? What did we eat from? We ate from the Eitz HaDat. What does it mean from the Eitz HaDat that suddenly we became master physicists and all Einstein? No, rather it's the Eitz HaDat ben Tov L'Ra is up until this point, God is actually the only one who is making decisions as to what is good and what is bad. And once humans eat from the Eitz HaDat, Chava does this, now humans are deciding for themselves what they think is good and what they think is bad. That's the liberation you speak of. We now have an independent judgment. But implicit in that, and this is what I think we're always trying to get back with, and it's not really maybe a full getting back. I mean, the Mishkan is not Gan Eden, the Beit HaMikdash is not Gan Eden. It's what Chava is saying is, we don't really need God. We can make these decisions on our own. We don't need God's sense of what is right and wrong. We have our own moral conscience to decide what's right and wrong, and that's what it means to eat from the Eitz HaDat. The recompense is, yeah, we want an adult, as you put it, I think you put it very well, a child relationship and then moving to an adult relationship. So when you're a child, your parents say, don't do X, don't do Y. Why? Because your parents say so. At some point, you're in your development stage, you're trying to get some independence from that. It's often manifest by a no. My parents said this, I'm going to say no. But then you eventually realize, well, maybe there was a wisdom to what my parents were saying. And I actually want to learn from what my parents were trying to teach me. And then there's sort of this coming back to it. And we wanted to have that adult relationship and tell God, no, I don't want to just do whatever you say is good and bad. But then there sort of becomes this realization is, you know what, you can't just be independent of God. We actually need God. And it's that coming together that I think is really what's going on here. And that Tuma and Tara is sort of that reminder is, you know what, if you're going to go through the world independently, you're going to encounter things in the world that are going to remind you that you're not actually independent from God. And that's everything you see. And therefore, we want to then find a way back as saying, okay, we want a way back, but it's now going to be not Gan Eden, it's the Beit HaMikdash, because we want it to be a way back, but that sort of navigates on our terms. So that might be how I would bring what you're saying kind of into the way I kind of see it.
You had said earlier that you want to kind of also have space to talk about the intricacies of comic book art. And we have a question from Dahlia that probes into that query. Wondering if it was intentional or coincidental that the feathers are probably the most traditionally stylistically figurative image in the comic. It's not drawn in the thicker outline lines of the rest of the comic, but with thinner lines and finer details. Thinking here of the spectrum of figurative versus abstract graphic style in Scott McCloud's guide.
Excellent, thanks. I love that question, and thank you, Dahlia, for asking it. Yeah, I think this question could be a springboard to answer in a few different ways. I guess to one of the neat things about comics is in the incorporation of both text and image. The text and the images can sometimes swap roles, and the clear distinction between the two of them isn't always so clear. And sometimes the text is acting like an image or the image is acting like a text. This is something that actually comes up a little bit more in some of my other pieces that I've made, but the one example that I can point to in this particular comic before I address the feathers a little bit more is when I have the word chumash written on this book. So it's both part of the image, but it's also it's a piece of text in a way. You read that word, it's a Hebrew word that says chumash. And also some of the other words are, not outlined in white or in any way. And so the question is how are these words or how are these images functioning? Are they more in the background? Are they more as images, or are they more part of the comic conventions? To answer to I guess like build on that sort of blurring between of the distinction, one of the things that I've been doing in addition to making the visual representations of the comics, I've been trying to make scripts that go along with the comics, and I'll share my screen for this as well. This is a practice that I had the opportunity to develop after talking with a friend and teacher, Joshi Finkel, who's really a wonderful advocate for accessibility. And we were talking about what it would mean to have screen reader text and a script sort of accompany the comics. And with the challenge of making a script for a comic, I have to decide what are images, and what's a caption, what gets described as an image and what gets described as text. So to go back, Dahlia, to your question about the feathers, I guess they're sitting more in the image world, right? It's not really part of the comic or it's not offset by the comic, but I guess it's being anchored as something that's more strongly an image in this case than a verbal element as well. Yes, definitely Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics. I'll take a minute to just name a few comic artists whose work have really helped inform my own practice. Definitely Scott McCloud is at the top there, both in his explanation of comics, but I have one of his books. This is Making Comics, but the filter will blur it out a little bit. Essentially, his representations of himself teaching information is one way that I've tried to incorporate into my own work. But then, of course, we have artists whose work is more in the graphic novel memoir camp. And of course, I'll have to mention Art Spiegelman and Maus, Alison Bechdel, specifically her work in thinking about memory, but also in incorporating text into her memories. And I think her second book, Are You My Mother, is a really nice way where she really references really deep research and analysis into her comics that are both visual and verbal. And then Linda Berry, I'll also mention as someone who does great work with memory and images and comics.
Rabbi, did you think that at the beginning of this fellowship, by the end of it, you'd have a comic book figure character of yourself depicted?
No, in fact, even when we started this Chavruta, I wasn't sure that that's where the comic was going. So I see Sophia has a hand up.
Yes, Sophia.
Okay. Thank you so much. I'm really fascinated by the project of making Vayikra especially meaningful, and Rabbi Jason, you just did it. Now I almost can't unsee. I used to think that the Tumah Torah was so esoteric, and now you're oh, this is obviously what it means. So I find that fascinating, and I'm kind of curious about that project in general, about looking for the meaning inside of these seemingly archaic korbanot and different understandings of ritual. Like we don't observe this today. So like there is a sadness to that, right? Like you made it meaningful and now we can't really do it today. But it also makes me wonder, like, how much are we like retroactively reading in something that might have not been there previously? Do you think that is an incorrect claim? Does that not bother you? Like, where do you see yourself in relationship to that kind of interpretation?
It's a part of the way, it's interesting. I approach Vayikra very differently than I approach other books of Chumash, particularly for the following, is that other books of, Chumash, before I even start, as I was mentioning to Estee and Veer, like for each year that I go through Parsha Shavuot, I have a different Parshan of the year. I have a different commentary. But before I even get to commentary, I generally look at the book almost as like the book it was written, it was intended to the reader, and what is God as the author want the reader to get out of the book? And that's the way I'll read Bereshit and Shemot and Bamidbar. Like the book had a message. There's a reason this book was written. What am I supposed to get out of the book? Vayikra, I think, is different because Vayikra is not just something that you're supposed to read, but a lot of this stuff was, and I think you hit on it, was meant to be experienced. You weren't supposed to read about a korban. You were going to see the korban. You wouldn't, if you were a Kohen, you would have been performing the korban, but most people would have, if you took a trip to the Beit HaMikdash, you would have been standing there, you would have been watching it. Certainly on the Shlosh Regalim, if you were there, you would have been seeing it. So when you read Vayikra, part of me, wants to just put my head in that mindset is not just what am I reading as if the book is an instruction to me, but what would I actually be seeing if I was there? Like, how would I visualize it? What is it? And what sort of emotions and, by the way, it's not just seeing, you'd have sounds and smells. I mean, and the smells are very much part of the korbanot. When it talks about the reach nichoach, the Ktoret has a smell. Then they said the Ktoret could be smelled from miles away. So what would the smells be like? What would the sounds be like? What would it's a much more meant to be experiential book. And you're right, we're not experiencing it. So how do you put yourself, into that experience to then learn, what it would mean? And the second piece is obviously to derive meaning from it. Is that these things have to be symbolic. I mean, there's a notion that there's a symbolism to it. And so you can try and think, okay, if I'm going to say this is a symbol, well, I can put a hypothesis, and my guess is almost as good as the next person's. But it would have to be, you'd have to pick, if you're going to pick something symbolic, it would have to be something that Bnei Yisrael was at least familiar with, and that they would probably at least have a good, claim to associate it with. Could I prove I'm right? No, not necessarily. But at least if I can say that something Bnei Yisrael would be familiar with and has a good likelihood to associate it with, that's how I can, see those, symbolism, to try and, get something in. So it's interesting, you just wrote about the dehokifying it. So actually, I've never liked the explanation that a chok is something that you don't understand. People have done that. In fact, I've actually, the way I've always understood chok is actually comes from the word chakak, which is to etch. It's something that's etched in stone, meaning it's something that's meant to be, sort of more permanent. It has a different, kind of, foundational notion as opposed to something we don't understand. If we don't understand, I like the idea that, just on a pure basis of simple faith, maybe there only needed to be one chok. God gave us one thing that we didn't understand, and that's it. Just to kind of test our faith. But I still think there's something to try and derive meaning, and the more you can try and figure out what you can understand, there's always something you can try and figure out. All right, accept it on blind faith if you can't. But it's just never resonated with me, this whole idea that you can't understand something.
Thank you. Thank you for having the empowerment to answer it that way. I think I would be too scared. And I don't think I've ever heard someone of rabbinic authority say that out loud and not amongst my friends. I appreciate it.
Watch, I'm going to get quoted on it and attend them on it.
Rabbi Kahana notes how this locus of alignment comes through a bodily experience. And Mitzora, this skin condition, really speaks to a connection between religion and body in a way that religion and body doesn't always treat people nicely, or those types of and I'm curious about both of your experience of trying to approach this parsha from a sense, from a place of well, at least just how would you approach it, and thinking about that question about body.
Or Jason, do you want to go first, or do you want me to?
Yeah, I'll let you take that first, and then I'll.
Sure. I think there's two ways that I would respond to that question, which I think is a really great question. One of them is to note that I think the question of bodies came up in our study and in our chavruta a little bit, and was something that I, in my earlier draft of the comic, was considering exploring it to some extent. The way that question came alive most for me was in thinking about the Beit HaMikdash and the Mishkan and who would have access to it. It was it's a repair solution, or fitting it into the framework of how it might be like Gan Eden. It's only accessible to some, and that some is very body dependent. And so thinking about the limits that our bodies might place on our ability to have access and to regain that access was something that felt like a question that I held. Ultimately, I felt beyond the scope of this particular comic, so I didn't really address it in this comic. But something that I do think does speak to it perhaps is that in this creative partnership with Jason, where we're talking about very experiential or body felt material, we have a comic in which both of us have our bodies represented, and we have a comic in where we're having dialogue, and we're part of the dialogue, and our bodies are part of the dialogue, at least representations of them are. So I think that is one way in which we get to participate and make sense of it.
So I think, the whole notion of actually body, and actually Rabbi Kahana's, notion of connecting it to mitzvot, I think is fascinating, especially in this, parsha. I mentioned, Tuman Torah really begins in the middle of Parshat Shmini, but then why does it get divided from Shmini to then Tazria Mitzora? Everything that happens related to Tuman Torah in Shmini is something that's external to our body. They're all animals, dead animals, nevela, unkosher animals. It's something external to us. When you get to Parshat Chukot and you get into death, Sophia said, come back to it. I have whole thoughts about Paraduma as well. That's also something that's external to us. But Chazal actually describe almost everything that's actually in this week's parsha as a tuma yotzeh min haguf, that it's a tuma that actually emanates from the body, which is, on the one hand, it's actually even things that are still kept today, like things like nida, is almost so jarring that how is like something that's like internal to us, suddenly becomes this source of tuma, and that's probably a longer conversation. But it's almost everything in this parsha emanates from the body. I think part of it that you could also think, and this also goes back to Gan Eden, and maybe to this notion of the V'al B'Shem Kot Or and put its skin on it. The very notion of the body is a limitation. That it's the body is also what makes us finite beings. That we're limited by our bodies. Our bodies put a limitation on it, which is compared to the, it's actually, this is where it makes sense to even use Kabbalistic terminology, the Ein Sof, to describe God as that which is, God is without limit. God doesn't have any limitations. Human beings are, have limitations, and all of our limitations are different based on our different bodies. But the body is the main symbol of that which divides us from God, that which separates us from God, and that God is Ein Sof, God is without limit, and we are, limited. And the notion that tuma perhaps can emanate from the body is in fact indicative of that. There's limitations both within us as well as the body itself. And maybe the notion of the mitzvot, to use Rabbi Khan's terminology of this realignment, is that maybe by performing mitzvot with our body is sort of a way for us to sort of surpass our own body's limitations, that our bodies can actually be not seen as limitations, but as actually a vehicle for us to, move higher and move beyond it.
Wow, yes. A definite round of applause. And I think both of you should take a bow. This has just been such a beautiful presentation. And the main chidush, the conclusion of the comic about the distance and that healing, I think really ties into such a beautiful connection back to the main chidush, one of the main chidushim of your Dvar Torah, Rabbi Herman, of kind of the distance and time that we have from Gan Eden, and how even though we're like echoing that distance, there's still the call and response of what we're returning to and what we're wading through in our own human lives. This has been just such a beautiful presentation on being able, and a masterclass in demonstrating to all of us how you can derive such deep meaning in through art, through creative expression, and through a beautiful probing. So thank you all for attending.
Thank you all for joining.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Dvir. Thank you, Rav Jason.
Yeah.
Have a beautiful Wednesday afternoon and a Shabbat Shalom.
Bye with everyone.